Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Junior English, and we now turn in your hymnals to 1294, 1295 and following, and the short story that we'll be looking at by Alvarez, Antojos. We're going to start with a real quick reading on 1294 to just introduce you to the story. Little did I know, Alvarez writes, little did I know when I was writing my short story Antojos that someday it would become the opening chapter of my first novel, how the Garcia girls lost their accents. It makes sense, though, that I would begin small. After all, I was an immigrant kid daring to join my voice to the literature of my new country. As I gained confidence, I would inch forward chapter by chapter towards a larger book-length form, a novel. I often advise young writers. I know I've had several students who have said in Room 303 who have said, I think someday I'd like to be a writer. Let's listen to the advice of a great writer. I often advise young writers who feel overwhelmed when they begin their first novels to think of each chapter as a short story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. When you finally put all those stories together, you will, of course, have to revise the whole from the perspective of a novel. But you will have written your first draft. This is another version of the writing advice that goes, write your essay, story, poem, word by word, page by page. That assures that each paragraph is beautifully and carefully crafted. Each word counts. Emily Dickinson, of course, she would mention one of our greatest American poets. One of my favorite writers once noted that there are, quote, no approximate words in a poem, end quote. Isn't that brilliant? Now that's a high standard for prose, but a passionate writer doesn't mind a challenge. But when I began writing Antojos, I was not plotting a novel. I'd been writing many short stories about being an immigrant and arriving in a new country. At some point, I wondered what it would be like for my characters to go back to where they came from. In one of my English classes, we had read a short story by Thomas Wolfe, whose bio mentioned that he'd written a novel titled, You Can't Go Home Again. Often in my own return trips to visit family in the Dominican Republic, I found myself feeling the same thing. Now, I could have written an essay addressing why exactly you can never go back to where you came from, elaborating central issues, citing research on returning exiles, maybe including certain personal experiences that supported my thesis. But that's not how a short story works. You actually play out a situation through characters and action and see where it takes you. It's like life. You'll live through an experience. And when you come out the other end and think about it, you go, wow, better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. She will quote the great Tennyson from In Memoriam. We'll study him in your senior year. But that lived experience that leads to that insight is what stories are interested in. And that experience, of course, happens to a character. In your life, it's you. In a story, it's someone you make up who might have a lot of you in him or her. Another way a story speaks is through details and little scenes of dialogue and interaction. In my story, I didn't know why I tacked that Palmolive poster on the Katina post. Sure, I had seen such posters when I traveled in the DR. A writer is always doing research. When I was describing the setting in my story, I pulled that little detail from past experience. Once it was in the story, I realized I had one of those loaded details that teachers sometimes call symbols, just a way of saying, pay attention to this detail. It has something to tell you, but it's never a set meaning. It's rich and ambiguous and shifts with each reading. Which leads to a final point about stories. They say what can't be put in easy capsule form. They don't have messages. They are luminous and mysterious. You can go home in some ways, and in other ways you can't. But only a story can include all these nuances and feelings and insights in a way that gives us pleasure and deepens our understanding of our lives. You can't sum up a story. You have to be there, and a good writer puts you there, word by word, page by page. And of course, let's look at Alvarez is a classic example of just how genius she is at this. I'm with you on page 1297. Notice she's born in 1950. And let's read a little bit about her life. Poet and fiction writer Julia Alvarez was born in New York City, raised in the Dominican Republic, as we already said, until she was 10 years old, when her father's involvement in a plot to overthrow that country's dictator was uncovered, and the family fled to the United States. She says, I came into English as a 10-year-old from the Dominican Republic, and I consider this radical uprooting from my culture, my native language, my country, the reason I began writing. First heading, writing to ease the pain. While moving to a new country changed her life, Alvarez quickly found her voice as a writer. She said, quote, I landed, not in the United States, but in the English language. That became my new home, end quote. As a young girl, Alvarez found that writing helped her deal with the pain of adjustment to a new culture and language. After graduating from college, Alvarez earned a master's degree in creative writing at Syracuse University. She went to join the Kentucky Arts Commission's Poetry in the Schools program. For 2 years, she traveled around Kentucky teaching poetry. The next heading, writing to understand. For Alvarez, writing is, quote, a way to understand yourself. You learn how you feel about things, and you're also making your little statement about things, and that makes you feel a little more powerful, end quote. Alvarez's poetry often focuses on her personal experiences as well as her Caribbean heritage. She's published 3 volumes of poetry, Homecoming in '84, The Other Side in '95, and The Woman I Kept to Myself in 2004. And you can Google to see what else she's done. Final heading, a storytelling tradition. After Homecoming was published, Alvarez began to focus on a new area of writing, fiction. My own island, quote here, my own island background was steeped in a tradition of storytelling that I wanted to explore in prose, end quote, Alvarez explained. The move to prose proved fruitful for Alvarez, has won the fame for 4 novels rooted in Hispanic American tradition. How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents, we mentioned before, in 1991, In the Time of Butterflies, 94, and Yo in 1997, and In the Name of Salome in 2000. Her fiction, like her poetry, deals with both the immigrant experience, her own bicultural identity. Let's jump over to 2B really quickly on page 1296. And let's do the literary analysis information here, and you're going to have to put some stuff in your notes at 2B. While many stories begin at the start of a series of events, some begin in medias res, is the Latin for in the middle of things, all right? You want to write that down, in medias res. Alvarez begins this story with her main character well on her way into the mountains. For the first time since Yolanda had reached the hills, there was a shoulder on the left side of the narrow road. In medias res is a plot device. You want to write that term down. Writers use to grab readers' interest. Other plot devices are, as you know, flashback. We want to write that one down, in which a scene from the past interrupts the action. And foreshadowing, the dropping of clues to suggest events that had yet to occur. As you read Antojos, notice how Alvarez uses all of these plot devices to fill in background information, heighten suspense, and add interest and excitement. Your reading strategy is to make predictions or anticipating events, a useful way to engage with a story and better understand its meaning. To make predictions, consider what you know about the characters and setting and apply your understanding of human nature. In this story, you may also consider background information about the Dominican Republic, and as you read, you can use the chart to the right. You've got 6 vocab words here that will obviously be on the examination. You want to pay attention to those. Let's jump over to page 1298. Let's write it in our notes at level 1 really quickly. That antojos is Spanish for cravings. Okay, cravings. So let's take a look now. The story explores additional, obviously, connotations of the words. Let's just say something about the background information here really quickly and this story. If you have ever taken a journey of any significant length alone, you recognize that it involves a mix of confidence, anticipation, and obviously fear. The main character in our story, Yolanda, you want to write that name down. Yolanda experiences all of those things in the story. She's returned to her Caribbean island homeland intent on demonstrating her adult independence from her family. As she travels through the countryside, aware of the region's unpredictable political climate, Yolanda must decide whom to trust and whom to fear. So this is going to be a story that's in many ways a character study of this character, Yolanda. Let's read the background information at the top of 1299 quickly. Yolanda's homeland, the Dominican Republic, won independence in 1844 after a rebellion against Haitian rule. Since then, the country has suffered through dictatorships and foreign domination. One of the most ruthless dictators was Rafael Trujillo, who ruled from 1930 until he was assassinated in 1961. Alvarez's father was part of an underground movement against Trujillo, and it was this involvement that forced the Alvarez family to flee the country. All right, we're now going to turn to the reading of the story. We want to pay particular attention now at level 1 to this character, Yolanda, and what are the experiences that Yolanda has to go through. Let's jump to 2B really quickly and write this down. One of the things we want to focus on as well is conflict. What is the conflict of the story? Remember, there's 2 types of conflict. External conflict, character versus character, character versus nature, character versus society or an idea. But there's also internal conflict, character versus self. I want you to jot down as you go through this story what you consider to be the primary conflict of the story. And by the end of the story, we're going to obviously ask about this title, Antojos, and what this means, this Spanish word for cravings, what one desires. All right, let's pay attention now. Read along. Try and stay up with our reading.
Antojos by Julia Alvarez. For the first time since Yolanda had reached the hills, there was a shoulder on the left side of the narrow road. She pulled the car over out of a sense of homecoming. Every other visit, she had stayed with her family in the capital. Once her own engine was off, she heard the sound of another motor approaching, a pained roar as if the engine were falling apart. She made out an undertow of men's voices. Quickly, she got back into the car, locked the door, and pulled off the shoulder, hugging her right side of the road. Just in time, too. A bus came lurching around the curve, obscuring her view with a belching of exhaust, the driver saluting or warning with a series of blasts on his horn. It was an old army bus, the official name brushed over with paint that didn't quite match the regulation gray. The passengers saw her only at the last moment, and all up and down her side of the bus, men poked out of the windows, hooting and yelling, waving purple party flags, holding out bottles and beckoning to her. She speeded up and left them behind, the small compact climbing easily up the snaky highway, its well-oiled hum a gratifying sound after the hullabaloo of the bus. She tried the radio again, but all she could tune to was static, even here on the summit hills. She would have to wait until she got to the coast to hear news of the hunger march in the capital. Her family had been worried that trouble would break out, for the march had been scheduled on the anniversary of the failed revolution 19 years ago today. A huge turnout was expected. She bet that bus she had just passed had been delayed by breakdowns on its way to the capital. In fact, earlier on the road when she had first set out, Yolanda had passed buses and truckloads of men, drinking and shouting slogans. It crossed her mind that her family had finally agreed to loan her a car because they knew she'd be far safer on the North Coast than in the capital city where revolutions always broke out. The hills began to plane out into a high plateau, the road widening. Left and right, roadside stands began appearing. Yolanda slowed down and kept an eye out for guavas, supposedly in season this far north. Piled high on wooden stands were fruits she hadn't seen in so many years. Pinkish yellow mangoes and tamarind pods oozing their rich sap, and small cashew fruits strung on a rope to keep them from bruising each other. There were little brown packets of roasted cashews and bars of milk fudge wrapped in waxed paper and tied with a string, the color of which told what filling was inside the bar. Strips of meat buzzing with flies hung from the windows of butcher stalls. An occasional display of straw hats and baskets and hammocks told that tourists sometimes did pass by here. Looking at the stores spread before her, it was hard to believe the poverty the organizers of the march kept discussing on the radio. There seemed to be plenty here to eat, except for guavas. In the capital, her aunts had plied her with what she most craved after so many years away. Any little antojo, you must tell us. They wanted to spoil her, so she'd stay on in her native land before she forgot where she had come from. What exactly does it mean, antojo? Yolanda asked. Her aunts were proven right. After so many years away, their niece was losing her Spanish. En antojo. The aunts exchanged quizzical looks. How to put it? An antojo is like a craving for something you have to eat. A cousin blew out her cheeks. Calories. An antojo, one of the older aunts continued, was a very old Spanish word from before your United States was thought of, she added tartly. In the countryside, some campesinos still use the word to mean possession by an island spirit demanding its due. Her island spirit certainly was a patient soul, Yolanda joked. She hadn't had her favorite antojo, guavas, since her last trip 7 years ago. Well, on this trip, her aunts promised, Yo-Yo could eat guavas to her heart's content. But when the gardener was summoned, he wasn't so sure. Guavas were no longer in season, at least not in the hotter lowlands of the south. Maybe up north, the chauffeur could pick her up some on his way back from some errand. Yolanda took this opportunity to inform her aunts of her plans. She could pick the guavas herself when she went up north in a few days. She was going up north? By herself? A woman alone on the road? This is not the States. Her old aunts had tried to dissuade her. Anything can happen. When Yolanda challenged them, what? They came up with boogeyman stories that made her feel as if she were talking to China dolls. Haitian Ougandans and communist kidnappers. And Martians? Yolanda wanted to tease them. They had led such sheltered lives, riding from one safe place to another in their air-conditioned cars. She had left the fruit stands behind her and was approaching a compound very much like her family's in the capital. The underbrush stopped abruptly at a high concrete wall, topped with broken bottle glass. Parked at the door was a chocolate-brown Mercedes. Perhaps the owners had come up to their country home for the weekend to avoid the troubles in the capital. Just beyond the estate, Yolanda came upon a small village, Altamira, in rippling letters on the corrugated tin roof of the first little house. It was a little cluster of houses on either side of the road, a good place to stretch her legs before what she'd heard was a steep and slightly, her aunts had warned, very dangerous descent to the coast. Yolanda pulled up at a cantina, the thatched roof held up by several posts. Instead of a menu, there was a yellowing, grimy poster for Palmolive soap tacked on one of the posts with a picture of a blonde woman under a spraying shower, her head thrown back in seeming ecstasy, her mouth opened in a wordless cry. Palmolive? Yolanda wondered. She felt even thirstier and grimier looking at this lathered beauty after her hot day on the road. An old woman emerged at last from a shack behind the cabana, buttoning up a torn house dress and followed closely by a little boy who kept ducking behind her whenever Yolanda smiled at him. Asking him his name just drove him further into the folds of the old woman's skirt. You must excuse him, Doña, she apologized. He's not used to being among people. But Yolanda knew the old woman meant not the people in the village, but the people with money who drove through Altamira to the beaches on the coast. Your name, the old woman repeated, as if Yolanda hadn't asked him in Spanish. The little boy mumbled at the ground. Speak up, the old woman scolded, but her voice betrayed pride when she spoke up for him. This little know-nothing is José Duarte Sánchez y Mella Garcia. Yolanda laughed. Not only were those a lot of names for such a little boy, but they certainly were momentous. The surnames of the 3 liberators of the country. Can I serve the Doña in any way? The woman asked. Yolanda gave the tree line beyond the woman's shack a glance. You think you might have some guavas around? The old woman's face scrunched up. Guavas? She murmured, and thought to herself a second. Why, they're all around, Doña, but I can't say as I've seen any. With your permission, Jose Duarte had joined a group of little boys who had come out of nowhere and were milling around the car, boasting how many automobiles they had ridden in. At Yolanda's mention of guavas, he sprung forward, pointing across the road towards the summit of the western hills. I know where there's a whole grove of them. Behind him, his little companions nodded. Go on, then. His grandmother stamped her foot as if she were scatting a little animal. Get the Doña some. A few boys dashed across the road and disappeared up a steep path on the hillside. But before Jose could follow, Yolanda called him back. She wanted to go along too. The little boy looked towards his grandmother, unsure of what to think. The old woman shook her head. The Doña would get hot. Her nice clothes would get all dirty. Jose would get the Doña as many guavas as she was wanting. But they taste so much better when you've picked them yourself. Yolanda's voice had an edge, for suddenly it was as if the woman had turned into the long arm of her family, keeping her away from seeing her country on her own. The few boys who had stayed behind with Jose had congregated around the car. Each one claimed to be guarding it for the Doña. It occurred to Yolanda that there was a way to make this a treat all the way around. What do you say we take the car? See, see, see! The boys screamed in a riot of excitement. The old woman hushed them, but agreed that was not a bad idea if the Doña insisted on